Michael's fingers twitched slightly, the first sign of life in what had been a 6-month coma. The sterile smell of the hospital room was the first thing that registered, followed by a vague sense of heaviness in his chest. Slowly, his eyelids fluttered open, revealing a dimly lit room. Machines beeped softly around him, their rhythm steady, unchanging. For a moment, Michael felt disoriented. He struggled to remember how he'd ended up here. His last clear memory was of driving home late at night after a stressful day at work. He was exhausted, the rain was relentless, and visibility had been poor. Then, nothing. A nurse entered the room and gasped when she saw his eyes open. "Mr. Carter, you're awake!" she exclaimed, rushing to his side. She called for the doctor, who arrived moments later, a mixture of surprise and relief on his face. The medical team began running tests, checking his vitals, and bombarding him with questions. But Michael's thoughts were elsewhere. He needed to see his wife, Emily. He needed to hear her voice, feel her hand in his, and know she had been waiting for him all these months. It took another 2 days before Michael was strong enough to speak clearly, and longer still before he could sit up without assistance. Each passing hour heightened his anticipation to see Emily. She had been the love of his life for the past 5 years, his rock, his anchor. He pictured her sitting by his bedside, reading a book or talking to him, even when he couldn't respond. When Michael finally asked to see her, there was an awkward pause. The nurse exchanged a glance with the doctor, who cleared his throat. "We'll contact her for you, Mr. Carter," the doctor said with a forced smile. Michael noticed the hesitation but dismissed it. Emily must have been overwhelmed during his coma, he reasoned. Perhaps she had stepped out for a break. Later that day, a woman entered the room, her face pale and drawn. It wasn't Emily. It was Karen, Emily's best friend. Michael's heart sank. Karen looked uncomfortable as she approached his bed. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling, "it's so good to see you awake." "Where's Emily?" Michael asked, his voice rough from disuse. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting away from his. She's not here right now," she said carefully. Michael's chest tightened. "What do you mean she's not here? Has something happened to her?" Karen took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously. "It's complicated," she admitted. "Emily?" She moved on. "Michael?" Mason said. Mason's phrase caught Karen's thoughts. "Like who?" Her words hit him like a physical blow. "Moved on?" he echoed, not understanding. Karen's eyes filled with tears. "She thought you wouldn't wake up. She couldn't handle it. She started seeing someone else." The room seemed to tilt around him. Anger, disbelief, and heartbreak surged through him in equal measure. "Who is he?" Michael demanded, his voice rising. Karen hesitated again, but she knew there was no point in hiding the truth. "His name is Daniel," she admitted. They're living together now." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. Emily, the woman who had promised to love him in sickness and in health, had abandoned him when he needed her most. As the days passed, Michael's anger grew. He couldn't stop picturing Emily with another man, sharing the life that should have been his. He became consumed by the need for answers. Why had she given up on him? How could she have replaced him so easily? Once he was discharged from the hospital, Michael began to piece together the fragments of his shattered life. He moved back into the house he had shared with Emily, only to find it empty. Her belongings were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. He found a stack of unopened bills and a letter from her dated 3 months after his accident. The letter was brief and cold. She wrote that she couldn't wait for him any longer, that she deserved to move on with her life. There was no apology, no hint of regret. Michael's resolve hardened. He needed to confront her, to look her in the eyes and demand an explanation. He tracked her down to an upscale apartment complex on the other side of town. When he arrived, he was greeted by the sight of Emily laughing with a man on the balcony. Her smile was radiant, her eyes filled with joy. She looked like a stranger to him, a woman who had never known pain or loss. Michael waited until the man left before he approached her door. When she opened it and saw him standing there, her face turned white. "Michael!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Surprised to see me?" he asked, his tone icy. Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I didn't know you were awake." "You didn't care to find out," he shot back. Her eyes filled with tears, but Michael felt no sympathy. "How could you do this to me, Emily? How could you abandon me when I needed you most?" She tried to explain, but her words sounded hollow. She talked about how hard it had been, how she had felt so alone, how Daniel had been there for her. Michael's fury boiled over. "You didn't even wait for me to die before replacing me," he said bitterly. "Was our love so meaningless to you?" Emily sobbed, but Michael couldn't bring himself to comfort her. The woman standing before him was a stranger, a shadow of the person he had once loved. As the weeks passed, Michael's obsession with Emily and Daniel deepened. He began to follow them, watching their every move. He saw them laughing together, holding hands, living the life that should have been his. The betrayal festered inside him, turning into something dark and dangerous. He couldn't let them get away with what they had done. They had taken everything from him, and he would make them pay. Michael started by learning Daniel's routine. He followed him to work, to the gym, to the coffee shop where he stopped every morning. He noted every detail, every habit. One night, he broke into their apartment while they were out. He stood in their bedroom, surrounded by their belongings, and felt a surge of rage. He opened Emily's jewelry box and found the necklace he had given her on their first anniversary. She had kept it, but it meant nothing now. Michael's plan began to take shape. He would make them understand the pain they had caused him. He would take back the life that had been stolen from him. The night he chose for his revenge was stormy, the rain pounding against the windows. He waited outside their apartment, watching as they settled in for the evening. When the lights went out, he made his move. Breaking in was easy. He had memorized the security code during one of his earlier visits. He crept through the darkened apartment, his footsteps silent on the carpet. He found them asleep in the bedroom, their bodies tangled together. The sight filled him with a cold, calculated rage. What happened next was a blur. Michael acted on instinct, his movements precise and unrelenting. When it was over, the room was silent except for the sound of his ragged breathing. He stood over their lifeless bodies, feeling a strange sense of relief. The weight that had been crushing him for months was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Michael knew he couldn't stay. He wiped down the surfaces, erasing any trace of his presence. As he left the apartment, he felt a sense of finality. The police found their bodies the next morning. The case made headlines, but Michael was careful. He had covered his tracks well, leaving no evidence behind. For the first time in months, Michael felt free. The past no longer haunted him. He had taken control of his life, even if it meant crossing a line he could never uncross. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of his actions began to settle on him. He couldn't escape the memories of that night, the sight of their lifeless faces. The revenge that had once brought him satisfaction now felt hollow. Michael realized that no amount of vengeance could fill the void left by Emily's betrayal. The life he had once dreamed of was gone, replaced by a darkness he couldn't escape. And so Michael disappeared, leaving behind the city, the memories, and the ghosts of his past. But no matter how far he ran, he could never outrun himself. Michael moved from city to city, changing his name, taking up odd jobs to survive. He avoided forming connections, fearing that his past might catch up to him if he allowed anyone to get too close. Nights were the worst. Alone in cheap motel rooms, he often found himself staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of that stormy night over and over. He thought he would feel peace, But instead, he was haunted by the weight of his actions. He began drinking heavily to numb the pain. Alcohol dulled his senses, offering him brief moments of escape, but the nightmares always came back. In them, Emily and Daniel stared at him, their lifeless eyes filled with silent accusations. No matter how hard he tried to forget, their faces were etched into his mind. One night, after several drinks, Michael wandered into a small bar on the outskirts of a forgotten town. The place was dimly lit, filled with locals who paid no attention to the stranger nursing a glass of whiskey in the corner. It was here that he met Rachel. In the slow sequence of events, Rachel came to him in a dream. Rachel was a waitress, her kind eyes and soft smile a stark contrast to the darkness consuming Michael. She noticed him sitting alone, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with pain. Against her better judgment, she struck up a conversation. "You look like you've seen better days," she said, sliding another drink his way. Michael managed a weak smile. "You could say that." Rachel didn't press him for details, and for that he was grateful. Over time, her quiet presence became a comfort. She never judged him, never pryed into his past. For the first time in months, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. But hope was a fragile thing. No matter how much he tried to start over, the ghosts of his past wouldn't let him go. One evening, as he sat in Rachel's small apartment, watching her cook dinner, he felt the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. She deserved to know the truth. "Rachel," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him, her expression curious. "What is it?" Michael hesitated, his hands trembling. How could he tell her? How could he explain the darkness that had consumed him, the choices he had made? He opened his mouth to speak but stopped. The words wouldn't come. "Never mind," he said finally, forcing a smile. Rachel frowned but didn't push him. She could sense there was something he wasn't telling her, but she chose to let it go. Days turned into weeks, and Michael found himself falling for Rachel. She was everything Emily wasn't: kind, selfless, and forgiving. He wanted to believe he could have a future with her, but deep down he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up to him. One afternoon, as Michael walked through town, he noticed a man in a dark suit watching him from across the street. The man's gaze was intense, unyielding. Michael's heart raced. Had someone recognized him? Had the police finally tracked him down? He quickened his pace, ducking into an alley. When he glanced back, the man was gone. But the encounter left him shaken. He couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. An intensity had him thinking of Salem's Lot and the eternal hauntings of those who lay clinging. That night, Michael packed his belongings. He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye to Rachel in person, so he left her a note. She dropped his purse inside his closet and walked out to the car with a note in her pocket. "I'm sorry, you deserve better than me." He disappeared into the night, leaving behind the only person who had shown him kindness since his life had fallen apart. Michael drifted from town to town, always looking over his shoulder, always haunted by the choices he had made. He thought about turning himself in, confessing to his crimes, but the thought of spending the rest of his life in prison terrified him. Years passed, and Michael became a shadow of the man he had once been. His hair turned gray, his face lined with regret. He lived in a small cabin in the woods, isolated from the world. He spent his days chopping wood, fishing, and trying to find solace in the quiet. But the quiet was its own kind of torment. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside reminded him of what he had done. He had taken 2 lives, and no amount of isolation could change that. One winter night, as snow fell outside, Michael sat by the fireplace, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He stared into the flames, lost in thought. He wondered if Emily and Daniel's families had found peace. He wondered if Rachel had moved on, if she was happy. A knock at the door startled him. Michael froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't seen another person in months. Who could it be? Slowly, he stood and approached the door. When he opened it, he was met with a figure he never expected to see. It was Rachel. She looked older, her face marked by time, but her eyes were the same, warm, kind, and full of questions. "Rachel," Michael whispered, his voice trembling. "I've been looking for you," she said softly. Michael's throat tightened. "Why?" "I left for a reason. You shouldn't have come." "I needed to know why you left," Rachel said. "I needed to know the truth." Michael felt the walls closing in. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding. With a deep breath, he invited her inside and began to tell her everything. He told her about Emily, about Daniel, about the betrayal and the rage that had consumed him. He told her about that stormy night, about the choices he had made, and the life he had destroyed. When he finished, Rachel sat in silence, her expression unreadable. Michael braced himself for her to leave, for her to call him a monster, but instead she reached out and took his hand. "I can't change what you've done," she said quietly, "but I can see the pain it's caused you. I don't know if you can ever make amends, but you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Her face tightened with fear and concern, and for the first time in years, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps redemption was possible. Perhaps, even in the darkness, there was a chance for light. Michael stared at Rachel's hand holding his, her warmth melting a part of the cold wall he had built around his heart. For so long, he had carried his guilt and pain alone, convinced that he deserved nothing but solitude and suffering. But now, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find some form of redemption. And so, Rachel's presence didn't absolve him of his sins, nor did it erase the memories of that fateful night. But she gave him something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to try. Together, they worked to build a new life, one where Michael could confront his past without letting it define him. Over time, Michael found small ways to atone for his actions. He anonymously donated to charities that supported victims of violence. He volunteered at shelters and soup kitchens, offering his time to those in need. Though these actions couldn't undo what he had done, they helped him feel human again. Rachel stood by him through it all, her quiet strength and unwavering support a constant reminder that he didn't have to face his demons alone. She encouraged him to seek professional help, and though it was a difficult journey, Michael began attending therapy. Slowly, he started to forgive himself, not because he deserved it, but because he needed to in order to move forward. Years passed, and Michael's cabin in the woods became a sanctuary, not just for him, but for others who sought peace and healing. He and Rachel turned it into a retreat, welcoming people who had lost their way, much like Michael once had. Together, they created a space where broken souls could mend, where pain could be shared, and where hope could be rediscovered. Though Michael never fully escaped the weight of his past, he learned to live with it. He accepted that he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could choose to spend the rest of his life trying to make the world a better place. In his final years, Michael sat on the porch of the cabin, Rachel by his side, watching the sun set over the mountains. The ghosts of Emily and Daniel still lingered in his mind, but they no longer haunted him. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far he had come, of the man he had chosen to become. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a golden glow, Michael took Rachel's hand and smiled. For the first time in decades, he felt at peace. The story of Michael Carter didn't end with redemption or absolution, but with the quiet acknowledgement that even in the face of darkness, there is always a chance for light. And in that light, Michael found his home.